Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Coyote Okikulu. The headlines. International Atomic Energy Agency to send inspectors to 2 sites at Kyiv's request. Russia calls up UNSC over alleged Ukraine dirty bomb, reiterating warnings about a potential nuclear provocation by Kyiv. And German president visits Ukraine for the first time since Russia's invasion. Well, the UN's nuclear watchdog says it will send inspectors to visit 2 nuclear locations in Ukraine after receiving a request to do so from authorities in Kyiv. The International Atomic Energy Agency said it was aware of statements made by the Russian Federation about alleged activities at 2 nuclear locations in Ukraine, according to a news release on the agency's website. The agency did not give the location of the 2 sites, and the decision follows allegations made by Russian officials in recent days that Kyiv planned to use a so-called dirty bomb in a false flag operation. The weapon is designed to combine a conventional explosive such as dynamite with radioactive material such as uranium so as to disperse radioactive material over a large area. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi received a written request from Ukraine to send teams to carry out verification activities at the 2 locations. U.S. Defense Secretary Lord Austin spoke with NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on Monday on a range of security issues, including Russia, and that's according to a Pentagon readout. Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Patrick Ryder quotes the readout as saying the leaders discussed recent diplomatic engagements with Russia, Russia's false accusation that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb on its own soil, and the need for Russia to de-escalate. It goes on to say that both leaders agreed on the importance of maintaining strong deterrence and defense, and emphasized that Russia's actions have resulted in what described as a stronger and more unified NATO. Austin had spoken over the weekend with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who accused Ukrainians of planning to use a so-called dirty bomb, a claim which U.S. officials refuted as a Russian false flag operation. It was a second call in 3 days between the top officials. Well, staying with reports about the reported dirty bomb, there will be consequences for Russia if it uses the so-called dirty bomb or any other nuclear weapon. That's according to U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price. Washington and other Western countries have accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of plotting to escalate action in Ukraine based on a pretext that Moscow believes Kyiv will use a dirty bomb, a device laced with nuclear material. Well, Price did not detail the consequences Russia will face, nor say whether they will be different depending on the type of weapon. Well, Price said that the United States has not seen any indication that Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon, but concern over the possible use of a dirty bomb was sparked by Russian officials' warnings that Ukraine was preparing to use such a bomb.
We've been very clear with the world, publicly with the world, privately with the Russians, about the severe consequences that would result from nuclear use. Again, to Matt's question, I'm not going to weigh in on every conceivable hypothetical. It would certainly be another example of President Putin's brutality if he were to use a so-called dirty bomb. There would be consequences for Russia, whether it uses a dirty bomb or a nuclear bomb. We've been very clear about that. The world is all too familiar with the Kremlin's track record. This is a point that we made prior to February 24th. It's a point we've made consistently since then. And there is a track record to back that up. Obviously, in this case, we are concerned that this false allegation could be used as a pretext for further Russian escalation. And we've made that concern very clear. At this time, though, we haven't seen any, not seen any reason to adjust our own nuclear posture, nor do we have indications that Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons. But we've heard these very concerning statements, and we wanted to send a very clear signal.
Elsewhere, U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi says Iran was making the world less safe by supplying Russia with drones to be used against targets in Ukraine. Pelosi arrived in Zagreb to attend a forum aimed at supporting Ukraine's independence and the return of the Crimean Peninsula to Kiev. Iran has denied supplying drones to Russia for use in Ukraine, and Speaker Pelosi, who visited the war-torn country earlier this year, has been a strong supporter of providing aid and military assistance to Ukraine since Russia invaded on February the 24th.
I'm not sure I've completely answered one question. First of all, we have to be able to counter the drones, and that is something that we have to do, which I won't go into right here. You see some success on the part of the Ukrainians already in stopping some of them, but it's a dangerous technology and it must be stopped. And that they would ally themselves with Russia in this regard should be a message to other countries who might want to refrain from voting in certain global bodies or just in their relationship with Russia to think again about it, because Iran has upped the ante. And if you're concerned about Iran, you should be concerned about Iran supplying Russia with this technology.
More stories now. Residents of the Russian-controlled Kherson region, evacuated by Russian-installed officials, have arrived in the Crimean town of Zankoy. The evacuees traveled by buses laid on by Russian-installed authorities in the south of Ukraine. Passengers say the situation in Kherson region remains difficult. Russia took control of most of Ukraine's southern Kherson region shortly after starting what it calls its special military operation in February, and proclaimed it as annexed in September, in a move that Kiev and West denounced as illegal. Russian forces have been driven back by 20 to 30 kilometers in the last few weeks and risk being pinned against the western bank of Dnieper River as Ukraine wages a counteroffensive in the region. Well, U.S. officials have dismissed the idea of direct talks with Moscow without Kiev's involvement after some 30 Democratic representatives wrote a letter urging President Joe Biden to pursue a diplomatic end to the conflict in Ukraine. A U.S. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby similarly stated that the Ukrainians must be part of any future negotiations. Kirby noted the U.S. administration appreciates the lawmakers' very thoughtful concerns, while Jean-Pierre admitted she hasn't seen the letter. Both, however, insisted that Russian President Vladimir Putin could choose to end the conflict at any time. In a letter to the White House, Congressional Progressive Caucus Chair Pramila Jayapal cited the destruction of Ukraine, the threat of nuclear war, and the economic turmoil visited upon Europe as reasons to pursue a negotiated settlement. Meanwhile, Russia will consider the use of a so-called dirty bomb by Ukraine as an act of nuclear terrorism. That's according to Moscow's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, in a letter to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Reiterating concerns voiced by Russian defense officials, the ambassador urged Guterres to do everything in his power to prevent this heinous crime from being carried out, while calling for a Security Council meeting on the matter. A diplomatic source told RIA Novosti that a meeting could take place as early as today. Russian President Vladimir Putin has invited Azerbaijani and Armenian leaders Ilham Aliyev and Nikol Pashinyan to Russia to discuss regional matters in the wake of recent tensions between Yerevan and Baku. According to Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, who confirmed the news, Moscow is concerned about the alarming trends in the region, where the West is clearly trying to transfer the confrontational schemes tested in Ukraine. It goes on to say Russian President Vladimir Putin invited the President of Azerbaijan and the Prime Minister of Armenia to Russia for the next trilateral summit, where it is planned to discuss a whole range of bilateral and trilateral issues. Commenting on the process of bringing the decades-long conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan to an end, the spokeswoman accused the West of pursuing a tactless and aggressive approach. Well, let's speak now to Oleksiy Haran, who's a professor of comparative politics, University of Kyiv, Mohyla Academy. He's speaking to us via Zoom from Kyiv. Thank you for joining us on the program. And I mean, it's been months and months of going about essentially the same things over and over again with, I mean, different issues coming up now and then. The recent is this word, the dirty bomb, which has come up yet again, Russia accusing Ukraine and saying, well, this is what we'll do if it happens. The US also wading in, NATO and the rest. And I wonder how you are internalizing all of these messaging. What is your thoughts so far?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that I'm happy because just recently, a few days ago, I have returned from a trip to Nigeria and Ghana, and I was part of the delegation of Ukrainian civil society. We met with authorities, with opposition, with experts, with mass media, and we appreciate Nigerian support of Ukraine's fighting, bipartisan support. This is really important for us. In your news, it was mentioned that Ukraine and the West do not recognize the results of the so-called referendums on annexation of the part of Ukrainian territory. Let me correct you. 143 nations in the United Nations, including Nigeria, do not recognize this referendum and denounced annexation of the part of Ukrainian, so-called annexation, because in fact Russians do not control it, by Russia. And only 4 countries supported Russia: Nicaragua, Belarus, Syria, and North Korea. That's all. So this is, we have huge international support, and we appreciate it so much. So thank you very much to all who is supporting Ukraine, and thanks again to Nigerian people and Nigerian government. Now, regarding what this all talk about dirty bomb, look, this is part of Russia's nuclear blackmail. It goes against any documents which were signed by Russia itself. I believe your audience should know that in 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and we had the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world. We gave it up in exchange for territorial guarantees for our country, and Russia violated it. Now, Russia occupied nuclear power stations, first Chernobyl and then Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear power station in Europe. And it never happened in history of mankind that a nuclear power station is occupied by foreign power. Russia is engaged in nuclear rattling all the time since February. It's very, very dangerous for all the people, not only in Ukraine. We in Africa, when we were in Africa, we were told of very bad situation in your agriculture for your farmers because of the rising prices for imported products, agricultural food, energy, fertilizers. Okay, now, and the food crisis is aggravated in Africa and in other parts of the world. Now, imagine that there would be a radioactive contamination in Ukraine. How would it reflect to the whole world and to global food security? And you know, we Ukrainians, when we were part of the Soviet Union, there was a Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe. So we know what does it mean. My family, I evacuated my my daughter and many Ukrainians had to evacuate their children because of nuclear catastrophe in Chernobyl. She
Right.
was under 1 year old, and when I met her in half a year, she didn't recognize me. She was crying because she didn't recognize me. So we know what does it mean, nuclear catastrophe and radioactive contamination. Unfortunately, Russia is playing this, I would say, dirty things in a very, very cynical way. But again, what Russia is doing is dangerous not only for Ukraine, not only for Europe, for Russia itself, because we do not know in what direction the wind would blow, and it's also dangerous for Middle East and for Africa as well.
You know, having spoken about the effects, primary or secondary, of this war on the rest of the world, I wonder for you, do you worry that countries might, begin to focus on their own problems? I mean, you've talked about the agricultural problems in Nigeria, for example, inflation across the world. I mean, some are even still battling COVID-19 and the effect. Do you worry that countries might eventually get so occupied with their own challenges, thinking, wait a minute, we need to solve issues that directly affect us, that we might forget about that support they've been giving Ukraine in one way or the other? Do you worry? What options then will be available to Ukraine?
Look, first of all, judging from my experience in Nigeria, and in Ghana, and we talk to very, very different people, people started to understand what does it mean, because they see the results of what Russia is doing. Russia is to be blamed for the food security and for the food crisis. Russia was blocking Ukrainian ports and disrupting the grain corridor, so-called. So it's necessary for all of us to understand, guys, you would like to overcome the food crisis, stop the war. You would like to avoid the risk of the nuclear contamination, stop the war. Russia is making such huge atrocities, human rights violations, that the world is shocked. Russians are doing crazy things. So, and that's why I believe with every atrocity which are revealed by Russians, the people in the world, they are starting to understand what's going on and who is responsible. Not all. Definitely, in many countries, there's a very, very strong Russian propaganda. But let me give you just one more example. Do you know who are natives of the Crimea occupied by Russia? Russians or Ukrainians? Do you know that? This is a tricky question, because neither Ukrainians nor Russians are the natives of Crimea.
Right.
Natives of Crimea are Crimean Tatars, Muslim people, and they are under oppression of Russia. And these people suffered a lot from the Russian Empire, from the Soviet Union, because the whole nation was deported. They returned back to independent Ukraine, and now they again repressed. Their representative body, Majlis, is banned by Russia. It's called extremist. So it's very, very tough situation. So, and
Right.
when we were talking about it in Nigeria, Nigerians were very sympathetic towards it. So they understand the problem, because you have your own Muslim community. So, and you see this huge violations of human rights. So,
and that's the interesting thing about the Nigerian. Right, the Nigerian situation now, some will say, is quite different. But by the way, during the course of this war, I mean, there are parties who say, or who accuse both Ukraine and Russia of propaganda, wondering who do we believe? And that's been a major challenge. But for Nigeria, which you talked about, the food insecurity, for example, some will say it's as a result of the flooding. If you've been following the news, there's been massive flooding in Nigeria. So that's an internal issue. There's been insecurity as well. Farmers weren't able to go to farms at some point, so that reduced food production. So, I mean, the internal issues clearly are caused by internal, factors. As I said, the flooding and No, pardon me, let me just land on that and the insecurity.
Okay.
So do you think that when countries begin to disaggregate this, for example, Nigeria looks back and say, well, we need to resolve the flooding, which is affecting food production, insecurity, which is affecting food production, which is local. Do you think that countries then can then begin to get carried away, which is the question I asked earlier? Do you worry that countries might begin to start looking inwards?
Again, my feeling, yes, Russian propaganda is very, very active. But let me disagree with you, because we are in democratic country. Nigeria and Ukraine are democracies. Russia is not. It's dictatorship. You cannot discuss things freely. But when you're talking about internal problems, look, you have the shortage of fuel, right? You have the huge problem with Islamic fundamentalism or even terrorism in northern country. And this terrorism is not just internal problem, it's international problem. And you know who are supporting these terrorists, and you know what does it mean to fight terrorism. You know about it. You have all these crimes made by Boko Haram in Nigeria, right? So we have huge human rights violations against Ukrainians, against Crimean Tatars. So I believe that those people who would like to hear, they hear, and they understand that it's not Ukraine which created all these crises. It's not Ukraine which attacked Russia, right? We are not bombing. Russia. I am sitting in Kiev. There is air alarm in Kiev every day, several times. Recently, there was bombardment of Kiev, and while we were in Nigeria, you know, we were trying to connect our relatives, our families, what's going on. And civilian objects in Kiev were bombarded. I'm talking to you right now. We have now the problems with energy. It can stop at any moment, because what Russians are doing, they are bombarding critical infrastructure of Ukraine. They are openly saying that we are going to make Ukraine and the whole Europe freeze in the winter. So this is a question. This is the question for international community. Would you like to live in the international jungles where there is only the law of jungles, the law of force, or you stick to international law, which also helps to provide international trade, which is beneficial for all?
Well, Professor of Comparative Politics, Alexei Haran, thank you so much for your insight on the program this morning. Definitely wish you the very best.
Thank you very much. We Ukrainians, we believe in victory.
Well, after the break, preparing for cold, Ukrainian servicemen near Russian border prepare trenches for a harsh winter. We have the details in a moment. Please stay with us. Well, you're welcome back. Ukraine's military claims Russian forces in occupied Kherson are preparing defensive positions along the east bank of Dnieper River and leaving small pathways for a potential retreat from the west bank. Speaking in a daily address, the armed forces of Ukraine said the enemy is arranging defensive positions on the left, that's eastern bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. Goes on to say near the settlement of Onostaikva. Engineering and Saper units of the Russian occupation troops are laying mines along the coastline, leaving small pathways for the potential retreat of their troops from the western bank. And more stories now. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier has arrived in Ukraine for a surprise visit this morning, marking his first trip to the country since Russia's invasion began in February. His spokesperson, Christine Gamelin, tweeted the president had arrived in Ukraine with a double message. The president was quoted as saying, "My message to the people of Ukraine is, you can rely on Germany. We'll continue to support Ukraine militarily, politically, financially, and humanitarianly. Let us never forget what this war means for the people here. With all the hardships that the war also brings for the US in Germany, or rather for us in Germany, let's look for a moment through the eyes of the Ukrainians," he says. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly address that his country was breaking down the Russian army. He also indicated the coming winter would be the most difficult in the country's history. The government is urging citizens to stock up on warm clothes, candles, flashlights, and batteries, while asking people to limit their use of energy-guzzling appliances like ovens, washing machines, or kettles during peak consumption times.
Ukraine is breaking down this so-called second army of the world, and from now on Russia will only be a side that asks. They're asking for something in Iran. They're trying to squeeze something out of Western countries, inventing varied nonsense about Ukraine. Russian potential is wasted on this madness, on the war against our state and the entire free world. There was influence through gas. There is none. There was military influence. It will evaporate. There was political weight. Now the ever-increasing isolation. There were ideological ambitions, now only discussed. And this is a very important change in the configuration in our part of the Eurasia. The more of its potential Russia loses now, the more real freedom all the peoples will get, both next to Russia and within its borders. Ukraine, first of all.
Well, staying with President Volodymyr Zelensky, he continued to urge for more air defense systems, saying that, according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia had ordered about 2,000 Shahid drones from Iran. Zelensky made the comments in a pre-recorded video address to the Haaretz Democracy Conference, which is an Israeli daily newspaper and news website. Ukraine's president says Russia might be offering Iran assistance with its nuclear program in exchange for Iranian-made drones that Russia has used to batter Ukraine in recent weeks, though he didn't offer any evidence to support that claim. Zelensky also spoke about why Russia had resorted to using drones. He says, quote, "Russia loses to us in a real confrontation on the battlefield. Putin's army does not know how to fight. We beat them on our land in such a way that it is forced to withdraw its contingents, even from other regions that they tried to destabilize." Zelensky's comments come about a week after Ukraine appealed to Israel for air defense systems like Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile system to counter Iranian ballistic missiles and long-range drones. Well, new Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Alexei Makayev, received his accreditation from German President yesterday in Berlin. Makayev had already introduced himself to Germany on Twitter, where he thanked Germany for their support of Ukraine, but called for more aid. Makayev is taking over from Andriy Melnik, easily the best-known ambassador Berlin has had, known for robust social media exchanges in which he has condemned as appeases politicians and intellectuals who opposed arming Ukraine for its fight against Russian invaders. Melnik, who's aged 46, became a central figure in debates over Germany's obligations to Ukraine. Ukraine's outspoken outgoing ambassador also had a blunt reaction to Musk's peace plan after billionaire Elon Musk asked Twitter users to weigh in on a plan to end Russia's war in Ukraine that drew immediate condemnation from Ukrainians, including President Volodymyr Zelensky, who responded with his own poll. The Tesla chief executive had suggested that Crimea, which Moscow seized in 2014, be formally recognized as Russia, and that water supply to Crimea be assured, and that Ukraine remain neutral. He asked Twitter users to vote yes or no on the plan. We'll now talk to Professor David Awurawa, who is the head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, UNILAG. He's speaking via Zoom from Akoka here in Lagos. Good morning, Prof, and thank you for joining us on the program.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
Right. So we've seen, as always, different countries being drawn in. Iran now, with the reported supply of drones, and now Israel with the request to supply Ukraine with drones. And I wonder, diplomatically speaking, Yes, some will say this is getting maybe messier by the day. But do you think that these countries really have a choice in that, well, this is maybe business on the one hand, and of course, hey, each country has its own sovereignty?
Yes, these countries are acting in line with provisions of their foreign policies. Virtually all the countries of the world have respect for the sovereignty of states and maintenance of global peace and security as an important strand of their foreign policies. So Israel and all the other countries that have recently now started to give support to Ukraine, they are simply acting in line with, foreign policies and their commitment to the United Nations. The United Nations condemns aggression and the use of force to push a country's interest in the international system. The position is just in line with their foreign policies. It is not in any way a threat to the sovereignty of any state. It's in defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine and in line with the provisions of the United Nations. So there is nothing really out of place in the support that all these countries have given to Ukraine in the last couple of weeks and months.
We've also seen, countries giving support, even reports saying that Iran, for example, supplying Russia with drones. So if it is fair for those other countries to support Ukraine, in line with their foreign policy and sovereignty, is it fair for those other ones to also support Russia and not be tagged as enemies?
Well, countries have different interests, and countries will always act in line with their respective interests. But in the case of Iran giving support to Russia, well, that is in line. Of course, we know that Iran is not in the good books of the West. Iran does not have a good relationship with the West. And so it is not surprising that a country like Iran who want to give support to a country like Russia that is also, anti-West. Countries that are supporting Ukraine are perceived to be countries that are on the same fold with the West. Iran's support for Russia is also not out of place, but of course, it is not in line with the provisions of the UN Charter. The UN Charter provides that countries settle whatever disputes they have diplomatically, not through aggression. And countries should respect the sovereignty of other states. That is the basic principle that the global system is built on. And that is what has helped the global system to maintain a measure of stability over the years. And so Iran's support for Russia is not surprising, but it is antithetical to the basic principles of the United Nations, namely respect for the sovereignty of states and also the use of diplomacy, not aggression, in the pursuit of a country's interest in the international system.
I know this might be a bit naughty, but, naughty with the K. But now you've said that diplomacy should essentially be a solution to this war. But, from what we have seen, it looks like diplomacy is not working. So would you say maybe this is also for students of foreign relations and diplomacy? Should there be some sort of review of the context, the framework of diplomacy? Should it be maybe extended, expanded beyond the current framework? Because if we're trying a solution to a problem and it's not working, perhaps we need to reinvent that solution. So maybe is this a time to reinvent diplomacy as we've always known it?
It is not diplomacy itself that is problematic. It is the application of diplomacy, that has had issues. Diplomacy is simply the management of international relations by negotiation. And as long as diplomacy, goes on, violent conflict is avoided. It is when diplomacy fails that violent conflict takes place. And so it is not diplomacy itself, that has issues, but the application of diplomacy. There are countries that do not want to subscribe to diplomacy in conflict resolution because they think that they have the wherewithal to be able to achieve their objectives by violence. And so what needs to be strengthened are the structures of the United Nations, actually, in terms of global conflict. For instance, the UN Charter provides that it's the United Nations Security Council that should take charge in matters of international peace and security. That is the provision. But when you also look at it, the Security Council has 5 permanent members who have veto power. That structure is anachronistic. It has outlived its usefulness. Can you just imagine a case where Russia's issue is discussed and Russia is there as a permanent member and uses its veto to knock off whatever is agreed to? What that means is that one country's position, one country's interest, overrides 190-something other countries' interest. So it is not diplomacy itself, but the structure and the application of diplomacy. The structure in terms of the UN configuration, it is now outdated. The UN reform needs to be carried out quickly so that the UN will be more effective in applying diplomacy correctly. If that structure of the Security Council, permanent membership and all that were not there, the UN would have done a lot better in intervening to resolve this matter. But the structure is just one that does not work. So the problem is not with diplomacy as a concept, to resolve international conflicts, but the ways and means by which the international system and the actors, have, applied it. It has not been well applied. That is why we are where we are, so to speak.
We'll come to the situation of Nigeria because we spoke about that with my guest earlier on. But I'd like to push this concept further because I think it's quite interesting going deep into this, and you're well versed in that area. So it's the negotiations, the diplomacy that I imagine got us to the point of having the structure of the UN Security Council, which you think should be tweaked such that, one nation does not have a power to veto over 100 other nations. But some will say, which then will be the lesser evil? So we have a current structure, at least a round table, where you can get the parties together. Yes, it looks like one is tilted against over 100 others. But the other option is to have a situation where there is even no table at all, because I imagine if those powers are taken, you might not have Russia on the table and others. So really, which then will be the lesser evil? Do you think this is maybe a greater evil than having no table at all?
Well, of course, anything human, nothing human that is perfect. Everything human has defects. But as far as the UN Security Council and the structure of the United Nations for maintaining global peace and security, as far as those issues are concerned, first, the Security Council's permanent membership, having just 5 countries, as we have now, is outdated. Can you imagine that Germany is not a member, Japan is not a member, Africa is not represented, Latin America is not represented? The provisions include at least one African country being a member, Japan, Germany also bring both in as members, and then the veto structure also will need to be reviewed. If a country, for instance, is the country in question, the country that is seen to be the aggressor, why should it be part of the negotiations in the resolution of that conflict? These are, the tiny issues that need to be addressed and tidied up, such that the UN and the Security Council itself will be more effective in responding to global peace and security. The other dimension has to do with the UN having more force. The League of Nations failed partly because It could only back, it could not bite. So the structure of the United Nations should be such that it will not only be something that can, an organization that can only, back, but one that can also bite. So these are the things that will need to be reformed and changed for the UN to be more effective in responding to issues of aggression and generally global peace and security.
So perhaps on the brighter side, this also presents an opportunity to make some much-needed changes. But let's end on this conversation I was having earlier with my guest about Nigeria's position and involvement. And I was asking him if he worries that a lot of countries, and I gave Nigeria as an example, I mean, we have the flooding disaster on our hands, food security, insecurity, inflation, and all of that. And then I was asking if he worries that some countries will begin to say, wait a minute, we have our own challenges as well. Yes, we're a brother's keeper, but you wouldn't have a brother if you don't have yourself in the first place. So do you fear that as well? Maybe that might be the next phase of this as we even inch towards this economic crisis.
Certainly so. You are right. And we have had that throughout history. When we have international crisis, economic crisis, countries tend to look inwards, or maybe even environmental challenge, as we currently have, arising from climate change and other causes. Countries tend to focus on their domestic affairs and do not pay so much attention to international affairs when that is the case. And the consequence of that is that the global system tends to be less stable under such conditions. So what we can only advise at this time is that as countries are struggling to grapple with their domestic challenges arising from the global crisis that we face, environmental, economic, and the rest, they should not be oblivious of the need to pay attention to global affairs. Because if one is paid attention to the detriment of the other, the crisis can only end. So countries should look away to focus on their domestic challenges as is expected, but also, ensure that international affairs are not abandoned, because that will exacerbate, conflict on the global scale. That would be our advice for, the major powers and countries of the world, so that the global system can be stabilized.
Right. So clearly they need to find that delicate balance. We'd like to thank you so much, Professor David Awurawo, who's the head of Department of History and Strategic Studies at University of Lagos. Thank you so much for joining us on the program this morning. We'll go on another break. This time, Russian courts to hear basketball player Brittany Griner's case. That's on sports, as well as business for you in a moment. Please stay with us. Well, servicemen from the Ukrainian National Guard are preparing for the winter on the front lines in the Kharkiv region. Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Zvistin said city authorities organized a program to install modular trenches there. The servicemen chopped wood and put the logs into a wood-burning stove inside the trenches. Well, the temperature there was about 25 degrees Celsius on Monday. Families are bracing for a harsh winter after Russian missiles and drones rained on cities across Ukraine earlier this month, hitting power plants and electricity stations and damaging around 30% of the country's energy infrastructure. Well, as usual, Laddie Williams, our business correspondent, is here this morning. Laddie, it's
morning,
good to see you.
Great to see you.
So we've seen the situation, or at least the potential situation of families in Ukraine as winter approaches. And I don't know whether to classify this as maybe some good news coming from the World Bank as it's disbursed additional $500 million to Ukraine. Is this maybe some good news? Where is this money going to?
Well, it's good news. It's a country at war, and they need, all the support they can get at this time, because they're not able to carry on with normal economic activities, at this time. So we see the World Bank that is buzzing an additional $500 million, but it's under a guarantee, from the UK, because at the end of the day, this money is coming from somewhere, and somebody's going to have to pay for it, because at the end of the day, we see Ukraine, we're seeing what they're going through right now. Total disbursements, as it is, stands about $349 billion altogether through the World Bank.
$349
billion. That's what's been disbursed.
Not millions.
No, sorry. That is actually what is needed. An estimate of what is needed to reconstruct, Ukraine at this time. But a lot of money has gone, to Ukraine from. We've seen NFT contributions, to Ukraine.
And you will know well about that, of course.
Exactly. So they need this money at this time to support, government spending and for critical services like health, education, and all of that. We've seen how, battered, the economy is at this time. And the World Bank is actually projecting that Ukraine's economy is going to contract, by about 35% this year. That's a big number.
It is. It's really huge.
That's why they're getting this support at this time.
And imagine those families who will be, I don't know, is it bunkering, trying to get much needed warmth during winter. Perhaps this drop in the ocean, as some have said, might get to them. But, on the flip side, we've seen that China's export to Russia has risen by more than 20%.
Yep.
But then elsewhere, growth is slowing. So help us understand this slightly.
So at the end of the day, Russia, they have their friendly nations, that they're still, able to transact with, even though we've seen the, sanctions by the U.S. and its allies. They've shown, Russia at this time. But, Russia, they still have China.
A friend in need.
Exactly, a friend in need at this point. And they also have Iran. So it's only natural that trade between friendlier nations are going to be higher, than what we have, with other countries. We've seen a drop, in demand at this time as central bankers are struggling, to fight inflation. Yeah. So they've raised rates. They've been aggressive, most part of this year. So we've seen that reduce demand, for Chinese goods. So at the end of the day, Russia, they don't have anybody else to trade with. They don't have much options, at this time. So they're trading, with China. They're getting the smartphones. They're getting a lot of containers, from China at this time. And we're also seeing imports from Russia, that's from China, actually increasing at this time about 55%. Obviously, the oil. We're seeing, Russia still able to sell its oil to the largest buyer of oil, globally, which is China. So this is helping to keep, Russia afloat at this time. Just remains to be seen how the friendly nations remain friendly, with Russia as this war actually escalates. But
so on another level, it's really business anyway.
It's business.
It's trade at the end of the day.
It's trade, yeah.
Well, Adi Williams, we'll be seeing you in just a few minutes on Business Morning.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for the insights.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk sports now. A Russian court is set to start hearing an appeal by U.S. basketball star Brittany Griner against a drug conviction for which she was sentenced to 9 years in jail. Her lawyers say she will take part in the hearing by video link from the detention center where she's been held, and that they expected a verdict the same day. The two-time Olympic gold medalist was arrested on February the 17th at a Moscow airport with vape cartridges containing cannabis oil, which is banned in Russia. She was sentenced on August the 4th to 9 years in a penal colony and a $1 million fine on charges of possessing and smuggling drugs.
They taught me my parents taught me two important things. One, take ownership for your responsibilities, and two, to work hard for everything that you have.
И мои родители преподали мне два очень важных урока. Это всегда признавать свою ответственность. И второе, это усердно работать для того, чтобы иметь все, что у тебя есть.
That's why I pled guilty to my charges. I understand everything that's being said against me, the charges that are against me, and that is why I pled guilty. But I had no intent to break any Russian laws.
Которые были мне предъявлены, я поняла и понимаю.
I want to apologize to my teammates my club, Gemka, the fans, and the city of ECAT for my mistake that I made and the embarrassment that I brought onto them.
Мои поклонники и товарищи по команде.
I made an honest mistake, and I hope that in your ruling that it doesn't end my life here.
Well, that's the program for today. Thank you for watching. I'm Coyote Okikulu. Coming up next is Businessman.